Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is David Wells with Netlify. We're going to be running through a quick demo of how to build an OAuth application on top of Netlify. So what exactly do I mean by that? Simply, putting a login with Netlify button into your own application or into an existing application you might have that will log users into their Netlify account. That'll give you back an API key for you to do stuff for them in their Netlify account. Now you might be asking yourself, what do you mean, David? Let's take a look at the demo real quick. So here I have a really simple React application. I'm going to go ahead and log in with my Netlify account. OAuth, authorize. It's going to redirect me back to that application. And I'm using the Netlify JavaScript SDK to just pull back a list of my sites. And I've just created a simple application here where I can sort my sites by team. I can sort by when they're last published or when they're last created. I can also search by the repo URLs and what have you. So this is a really simple application, about 200 lines of code, using Netlify OAuth and React to basically create a custom UI for this view. But there are a ton of different API methods we can actually use with Netlify's Open API. So in that demo I just showed, I'm actually just calling the list sites. There are a huge number of API methods that Netlify exposes to create deployments, trigger site builds, to update form submissions, to pull back form submissions, to do a bunch of different things. And in that React code, I'm using the just the JavaScript SDK. We'll take a look at the code in a little bit, and we're going to walk through setting up a new OAuth application later in this video. So some other use cases for why you might want to build a Netlify OAuth application. I mentioned building custom UI. We have a user who actually built a desktop application for Netlify, so you could manage his sites locally without having to log into app.netlify.com. You might want to build an app that accesses an existing user's site to update maybe their site snippets or to trigger deployments. We have a lot of CMS companies that are integrating login with Netlify into their own applications. But yeah, it's really, if you're building any kind of application and you want the ability to create or update or manage any of the resources in that user's Netlify account, you'd want to use a flow similar to the one that I'm going to show here today. So how does all this work? We'll take a look at the high-level architectural overview, and then I promise we will jump into the actual code. So here we have our application that we just saw with that login to Netlify button. We are using two server-side serverless functions. Wow, quite a mouthful there. We're using Netlify functions here in our application, which we'll see when we jump into the code. There's one that starts off the auth flow. That'll redirect us through to that Netlify login screen. There we log in, everything's good. It returns back an auth code, which we exchange for a token. This is a normal OAuth flow, by the way. And this works, this similar setup works with any type of OAuth kind of flow that you're setting up, and you can use Netlify functions to do that. So if you wanted to add in Facebook login or Twitter login, etc., you can use serverless functions in the same fashion. But I digress. This is using Netlify as the OAuth provider here. After we get the auth code from Netlify, after we've logged in, we exchange that, and then we hit the second function, which is the Auth Callback. That has the access token that we can use to call into the Netlify Open API to list sites, create sites, update sites, all those good things that I've previously mentioned. So that token, you can save that into your database, or in our case, we're just going to be redirecting back to the client. So that token is in the client. You want to be cautious with sending that token back to the client, and make sure you're protecting against cross-site scripting and what have you, which we'll look into when we look at the code. That is the high-level architecture in a nutshell. This does look pretty complicated, but when we look at our code, we'll see that we just have two functions in our regular Netlify site, and that's pretty much it. And we'll go through setting up the actual OAuth application inside of Netlify. So let's do it. Show me the code. The repo, if you want to follow along, is inside of Netlify Labs under the OAuth example. So if we take a look at the site itself, this was bootstrapped with Create React App. So I have just a vanilla Create React App in here, as well as a functions directory that contains my two functions. So that auth start function that we saw in that diagram, this is auth start, and then the auth callback. So those are our two functions inside of our source code. If we take a look, I created a utility in here as well. We're using an npm package called Simple OAuth 2. This is basically what Express Passport is using under the hood to do a lot of their handshaking and what have you. I'm not going to go too deep into this code. You can literally just copy and paste this out and use these two functions to get up and running. But there are some values that we do need. So there are two environment variables that I have set in my site. That is the Netlify OAuth client ID and the Netlify OAuth client secret. So we go into the Netlify admin UI inside of my OAuth example. We can see here under the build environment variables in the deployment settings, we have the client ID and the client secret set. So when I deploy these functions, they're going to read those tokens off of the process.env, and I just have it written this way so I throw if I'm missing them, just a little helper, but this is the same thing as just doing this. But yeah, so these are the two values that we need. If you do rename your function, the auth callback URL, that's actually where our function lives. So the site URL, that's provided when you build your site. And then the .netlify/functions auth callback is where we're going to be redirecting people. Let's go into Netlify and create a new OAuth application just to see what that looks like and where those settings are input. So under account settings, under OAuth applications, you will see your OAuth applications. You might not have anything here. I'm just going to go ahead and set up a new one. So testing OAuth, give it a name. The redirect URL is going to be your site URL back to that callback function. So in our case, it's actually going to be, and this is the convention for all Netlify functions. So .netlify/functions/ the function name. So auth callback. So I'm going to go ahead and place that in there. And then we'll just say a description like testing OAuth. So this is how you create your OAuth application. Once you create this, you'll see it in the list here. If you click show credentials, you'll see your client ID and your client secret. These are the values that you need to plug into that site that we just saw. So I'm going to go back over there. So again, in my OAuth example site, if I go into deployments, into deploy settings, I want to plug in those two values in here. Luckily these are hidden, so I don't have to change that. You do want to keep your client secret secret for sure. Otherwise, people could do bad things with your OAuth application. So you want to avoid that. So going back into the code, so this is the auth client. We are exporting the OAuth instance, and it has all the required values These are the OAuth OpenID values for Netlify. If you're using, doing this for Facebook or GitHub or Twitter OAuth, these values would change to their API endpoints. So we're exporting the auth and we're using that in the start of the authentication. So we can see here we're importing the auth module with the config and the OAuth. When this actual OAuth flow starts, let's go and look at our client. So I'm going to go ahead and just log out. If we look at this URL of our button, I guess it is in the source code. If we go look at the source code, I'm not using a normal link, I'm using a different one. So when someone clicks on this button, the login to Netlify button, inside of my source code, I have this handle auth function, and that is basically redirecting them to the Netlify auth start function. And it has two parameters on there. I'll discuss those in a little bit. One is just where to redirect users to. This is a single page application, so there are no, this could be hard coded. And then the cross-site request forgery token. This is for security purposes, which I'll talk about later in the video. But simply put, when I click on this auth start, it's redirecting me through that function, through this auth start function. I'm reading the two values off of the query parameter. And then I'm using the OAuth client to create an authorization URL. Setting the state, and the state is actually what we can use to pass that token through to stop malicious things from happening. And then down at the bottom of this function, I'm just returning a 302 with location headers, and that's actually what redirects us to this link right here. So this function that the OAuth client is that we're using from the OAuth client is generating the authorization URI, which is what we can see in our browser right here. So that redirects us to Netlify's OAuth login screen with the values we pass through. So here's our cross-site request forgery token and the redirect URL, and that's in the state parameter. Not terribly important, we'll get into that in a little bit, but yeah. So this is also just an example of how to do a redirect in a function. I could redirect this function to like google.com, for example. So if you have a function that you want to use for handling redirects, dynamic redirects, you can do that with functions. So that's the start of the flow. So again, if we go back and look at our diagram, we've clicked on that handle auth function from our front end application. We've hit the auth start function. I'll just go ahead and rename this right now since we're here. Auth start. This app that I'm using, by the way, it's called Cloudcraft. Super awesome for building architectural diagrams. Highly recommend it. Yeah. So cool. So now we have so we're on our Netlify login screen. If I go ahead and log in and authorize this, it will continue the flow. So the rest of that flow is like, hey, green check mark, I'm in, I've logged in with a real Netlify user account. It redirects me back to the callback URL. So if you remember in our OAuth application that we set up, again under account settings and into OAuth applications, we set that callback URL right here. So your site URL .netlify/functions, that's a typo, back to the auth callback. So now that's what tells Netlify at this step to redirect us back to that function that handles the rest of this flow. Let's take a look at the auth callback URL. So again, we are importing the OAuth client that we have from that util that we set up with all those parameters earlier. If there are no query string parameters on this URL, we go ahead and exit. Someone's trying to exit or access our auth function without, basically the code on there or any state. So it's someone trying to do bad things. So we just go ahead and say you're not authorized. If that stuff is in there, we go ahead and take that grant code from Netlify's OAuth. We then pass that into, again, the OAuth client to generate and call in to get the actual access token. So here is basically where we're saying like, okay, we have the code. We're in that function. We're going to take that code and ask basically Netlify one more time for an access token. And then it passes it back through that chain back into the function. So that's what this function right here is doing, the get token. So we pass back the code along with our OAuth client ID and our OAuth client secret again, and it creates the access token. In this function, I'm actually calling to Netlify. This is optional. This is just what I'm doing for my application. But if we look at the top of the code here, we have a get user function being imported from a Netlify API utility that I have. I'm just simply using fetch to call into our open API. So likewise, you could install the Netlify client in Node, which would be just like this. And then I can call methods off of that, like netlify.await, like list sites or what have you. We're actually using that client in the in our React application, which we'll take a look at in a second here. But here I'm just calling into Netlify to grab the user ID, their user information that I might store in a database or something like that. In this application, I'm not actually storing it anywhere. I'm actually just passing it back into the client. So I encode it, and the final step here is I'm actually redirecting back to the client. So you'll remember this state.url. That's actually originated way back here on the client, which is this URL, which is really just like, hey, redirect to my application. But yeah, basically we are redirecting back to oauthexample.netlify.com with some encoded data and the cross-site request forgery token, as well as the actual Netlify API token. I'm encoding this and then decoding in the browser just as an added security through obscurity thing. And I'm also putting this in a hash because if it's in a query parameter, like servers can read that. But if you're passing this back as a hash, servers can't pick up any values past this hash. So you'll notice whenever you log into any type of application and it redirects you somewhere, typically it'll be behind a hash mark like that. So yeah, so once I have gotten the code back and then done that handshake one more time in the normal OAuth flow, I'm actually doing another redirect here back to the front end application. So that's basically where I've redirected back here, and basically it looks like this. So I have all the values after that hash. In my front end code, way up at the top here, right at the constructor, and I'm sure there's a new fancy way to do this with React hooks. I'm just parsing the actual hash of my app, and I remove it really quickly so people can't copy and paste that, and they don't share things that they shouldn't with other people. And yeah, I'm checking if the token is what the local storage token is, and then just setting the state, etc. So I'm setting the user that's from the response, and then I'm decoding the actual token. So I encoded it on the server side with buffer to a binary, and then in the actual front-end application, when I use it, Again, this is the Netlify API. So I'm just importing Netlify API from the Netlify package. So when I actually use that, I use the browser ATOB to decode it. This is not, this doesn't protect the token, by the way. This is just, again, security through obscurity. If someone were to somehow grab the URL with the hash, they would need to know that they need to, do something else with it. Yeah. But yeah, once I set up the Netlify client, I can call any of those open API endpoints that we were talking about. So list sites, create site, get site, delete sites, update build hooks, whatever you want with the Netlify API. That's now available, in the browser or server side if you're running your logic on the server, etc. So yeah, and that's pretty much it. The rest is really just the UI for this application. I'm not going to go too deeply into. It's just mapping over the data. So once I call into Netlify list sites, I get back all of the sites that I have in my account, and then I just set that to the state. And then the app re-renders, and I have this beautiful list of my sites where I can filter and search for different things, or see which site has the most functions and what have you, or see what the function names are and what have you. Whew, that was a lot. So yeah, to recap, it's really the meat of the logic lives inside of the Netlify functions here. I have a netlify.toml file in my project that says where my functions live, as well as my build command for the front end. So if I want to deploy this application, make sure I didn't update any of these. Yeah. So if I want to deploy this application, I can just run netlify deploy -p for the production site. That will run my build process and then upload the functions to my site. If we go and actually look at this site, we go into the demo team, into the OAuth example, we can see there are two functions inside of Netlify. If I'm debugging this, what I can do is inside of my functions, I can console.log out different values in the flow. So if I want to see, what the query parameters are, I might just log out a label and the query parameters, and then I would just deploy those back up. You can also git push the code, but this is just a quicker way to deploy your functions and test stuff. That'll pipe up my functions where we can actually see this stuff. So let me go ahead and do that. So I've just saved the function and I'm deploying it. If we go up to the function now, look at auth start. So we can see that it's saying that the function actually started, but let's go ahead and so again, my site, if my app doesn't save the token anywhere, you really shouldn't save an API token in local storage or as a cookie. In my example, the user's logging in each time. In a more robust application, you probably store that token securely in your data store, or have the user log in each time they need to do something. It depends on your security requirements. But yeah, let's go ahead and log in again. So just logged in again, and we can see here, hey, there's my log. So I can actually see the values passing in to make sure that nothing's null or that the values are what I expect. Because if they're not, somewhere down this chain, like this get authorization URL might fail, or what have you. So that's just a quick tip on debugging functions. You can just add a console.log statement in your function, do a netlify deploy -p, that will deploy it to the live URL. You can deploy this to staging URLs as well. I would just deploy it up to the production URL. Don't do that if this is a live production site though. The other thing that you want to do if you are running these deployments from the CLI is you actually would want to run your build, npm run build, and Netlify deploy -p. So this will actually build my front end and then deploy the front end and the functions together. Typically what I do in a project is I'll put a deploy script that just is an alias to that, and that will deploy up my functions real quickly, and also update any front end changes I might have enacted. And that is how you build an OAuth application using Netlify OAuth and Netlify functions. This entire repository that we just walked through is available at github.com/netlify-labs OAuth-example. You can actually just go ahead and deploy this up from there. If you do have any questions, like this curious little puppy here, if you do have any questions about this or anything else related to Netlify and building on top of Netlify, feel free to reach out to me anytime on the Twitters. I'm at David Wells. Happy to field any questions or answer anything you want.